Okay, so at its high point, the Mongol Empire was absolutely massive, and the impact that the Mongols had on conquered people varied from region to region. So I'll just give a quick overview of the impact of Mongols on China, on Persia, and on Russia. Of all the conquered territories, it was China who put up the hardest fight. So it took the Mongols 70 years of more or less continuous warfare between the years 1209 and 1271 to completely conquer China. The Mongols didn't have too much trouble conquering northern China, which at the time was ruled by dynasties of nomadic origin. But in southern China, they faced off against the mighty Song dynasty, who put up much more of a fight. But eventually, the Mongols were able to conquer China. And initially in China, the Mongols were absolutely brutal towards the people when they were conquering the country. So in their military expeditions, they were absolutely brutal and massacred many farmers. But once they established control, they treated the conquered Chinese seemingly better than they did conquered people in other territories. So Mongol rulers tell farmers, "Hey, as long as you don't rebel against us, we'll let you keep your land and keep living your life how you're living it." When it came to running China, the Mongols really had no idea how to run a complex farming civilization, so they relied on a lot of Chinese advisors to help them run the country, and they tried to run it as much as possible as how it had traditionally been run. So when the Mongols came to China, we know the north and the south weren't unified. The Chinese, for their part, saw a unified China as being the natural order of things. So the fact that the Mongols were actually able to unify China meant that some people came to see the Mongols as actually having been granted the mandate of heaven. And despite the fact that they were these foreign nomads, they were the people that heaven had chosen to rule over China. So we looked at that concept of mandate of heaven and how that has impacted Chinese history. The Mongols established a new dynasty, and they referred to themselves as the Yuan. And the term Yuan means great beginnings. So the Mongols moved the capital of the empire from Karakorum in Mongolia to what is now Beijing, and renamed Beijing Khanbalik, or the city of the Khan. The most notable Mongol emperor in China was Kublai Khan, and he ruled from 1271 to 1294. And Kublai Khan is generally well liked by Chinese people. He treated the Chinese fairly well. Many of his policies evoked the values of a benevolent Chinese emperor. So he did things like he improved roads, he built canals to facilitate trade. He lowered taxes, supported the arts, limited the death penalty, supported agriculture, prohibited Mongols from grazing animals on farmland. So he actually did a lot of good things in China. But at the same time, a lot of Chinese were upset at foreign rule. So in China, the Mongols stayed Mongols. They kept their culture and they didn't mix too much with the Chinese. A really good example of this is in Beijing. In the middle of the city, you have the Forbidden City, and this was established by the Yuan dynasty. And the Forbidden City was supposed to be a recreation of life on the Mongolian steppe. So they would plant steppe grass within the walls of the Forbidden City. They would have animals grazing, roaming freely, and the Mongol elite, the most powerful people in China, would live a traditional lifestyle within the walls of the Forbidden City. So the rulers, the bureaucrats, they would sleep in traditional felt tents. They would eat in their tents. They'd give birth in their tents. So in the end, the Yuan dynasty lasted little more than 100 years. By the mid-14th century, there was infighting among the Mongols. There were rising prices in agriculture. There were epidemics of the pet plague. There were peasant rebellions. And all these things forced the Mongols out of China. So the Mongols would stay on the periphery of China. They would continue to invade periodically from their Mongolian homeland. But their days of rule in China were over pretty quickly. So the dynasty that came to power after the Mongols, the Ming dynasty, made a renewed commitment to traditional Confucian values, and people were quick to get behind those after 100 years of Mongol rule. The second great civilization that was conquered by the Mongols was Persia. The takeover in Persia happened more quickly than China. The first invasion was 1219 to 1221, and this was actually led by Genghis Khan. And 30 years later, a second invasion came from 1251 to 1258 by his grandson Hulagi Khan. And Hulagi ruled until 1265. He became the first Il Khan, or subordinate Khan, of Persia. The difference between this and China is that these were two separate invasions, happened 30 years apart. With China, it was really 70 years of continuous warfare. To Muslims, Mongols were infidels. So, whereas the Chinese saw that maybe these Mongols actually had the mandate of heaven, Islam was having none of that. The victory of the Mongols came as a shock to the Islamic world because Muslims viewed history as being the progressive expansion of Islam and believed that natural course of history was towards an Islamic world. The Mongols were more brutal towards the Persians than they were towards the Chinese. In 1258, when the Mongols attacked the Abbasid capital at Baghdad, 200,000 Muslims were massacred, and this attack on the capital was pretty much the end for the Abbasid dynasty. So the Mongols destroyed the Song in China and the Abbasids in the Islamic world. Once in control, the Mongols placed heavy taxes on peasant farmers that the peasants really couldn't afford to pay. So usually those types of actions would lead to a peasant uprising, rebellion, but peasants couldn't rebel because they knew they'd be destroyed. So you saw these mass fleeings from the land. So farmland was deserted, was transformed into pasture land. So initially, Mongol rule in Persia was a total and complete disaster. Things did get better under the rule of Mahmud Hazan, who became the ruler in 1295 at the age of 24. So Hazan was a very cultured guy, very intellectual guy, another descendant of Genghis Khan. And Hazan tried to repair the damage caused by earlier Mongol rulers in Persia. He did things like he rebuilt cities, he fixed irrigation projects, and in the year that he became ruler, he also converted to Islam along with many of his followers. So what happened? Mongols in Persia followed Hazan's lead and converted to Islam. Mongol Muslims married local people, they became farmers, and in 1330, the line descended from Hulagi Khan, or from Genghis Khan, ended because there was no suitable heir. So in China, the Mongols were driven out back to their homeland in Mongolia. The Mongols were never really driven out of Persia. Really, in a span of less than 100 years, the Mongols had become Muslims, the Mongols had become farmers, and from a Persian point of view, the barbarians had been civilized, and Islam proved victorious and proved very resilient and ruled the day once again. And the final civilization that I'll look at is Russia, and the Mongols came to Russia between the years 1237 and 1240, where they encountered a relatively new civilization. So when the Mongols arrived in Russia, Russia wasn't unified like southern China or like the Abbasids. It was just a bunch of small kingdoms that were fighting against each other. So these kingdoms couldn't really put up any sort of real fight against the Mongols. But the Mongol rule of Russia was different because they never directly occupied Russia. So the Russian economy was nowhere near what it was in China or in Persia. Russia wasn't an advanced civilization. It wasn't located on major trading routes of the Silk Road or the Indian Ocean basin. So the Mongols didn't really see it as being worth occupying. On top of all of that, there's plenty of available pasture land north of the Black and Caspian Seas, so the Mongols could live the way they preferred to live, like they did in Mongolia. They could live their nomadic pastoralist lifestyle. So we see in China, they tried to recreate that with the building of the Forbidden City. In Russia, they didn't have to build any kind of artificial environment. It was easy enough for them just to set up on the steppe within close reach of the Russian kingdoms, and exploit them from an arm's length away. So the Mongols exploited the Russians by demanding that the Russians pay tribute, or the Russian princes and kingdoms pay tribute to the Mongols. If they didn't pay tribute, the Mongols would attack them. So just really extorting money from these civilizations. Uh, some Russians did benefit from the rule of the Mongols. So, for example, the Orthodox Church flourished under the Mongol policy of toleration. The Orthodox Church was exempt from paying taxes. But also, princes in certain kingdoms were able to gain more power. Some princes allied with the Mongols in raids against other Russian kingdoms, and they were given part of the loot in return. So some of those princes that became close allies with the Mongols benefited quite a bit, and Moscow emerged as a major center for collecting tribute. So princes in Moscow sort of parlayed this position into building a more powerful Russian state. The Mongols were far less influenced or assimilated by Russian culture because they had less direct contact with Russians. So in China, Mongols became the Yuan dynasty. In Persia, they became Muslims and farmers. The Mongols did not become farmers or Orthodox Christians in Russia. They did eventually become Muslims, so the Mongols stayed on the periphery of Russia, but as the Mongol Empire lost power and a new Russian state emerged, the Mongols really lost their hold of the Russian economy, and they were eventually absorbed into another people called the Kipchak, who were a nomadic Turkic people who had converted to Islam. So, the nomadic pastoralists typically receive a really bad rep in world history. History only tends to talk about these people when they're threatening or destroying an already established civilization. The sources that exist about these people are usually written by the literate civilizations who are the enemies of these people, so it's usually a very negative view of these people. Now, historians are trying to present somewhat of a more balanced view, emphasizing not just what they destroyed and how brutal they were, but also what they created. So, yeah, the Mongols at times they were extremely brutal, but so was the Roman Empire, so was Alexander the Great, so were the Assyrians. But history focuses more on the contributions of these people. So, thinking about some of the contributions of the nomadic pastoralists, well, they adapted their way of life to survive in environments where nobody else was able to survive. They developed new technologies to survive in these environments, and they brought the world closer together. First, with the role that they played in world trade, long distance trade, and later by the empires that they themselves created. So, this is the end of episode 13, The Nomad's Moment in World History. Thank you for listening.